My stepfather charged me rent at 16, kicked me out at 18, and 12 years later demanded $200,000 of my lottery winnings because he said he was the man of the house. My mom married Roger when I was 14. He moved into our house, took over the master bedroom, and immediately started making rules. His house, his rules, that's what he said, except it wasn't his house. It was my mom's house. My real dad left it to her when he died, but Roger acted like he owned everything the moment he put a ring on her finger. He made me call him sir. He gave me a curfew of 8 p.m. even on weekends. He complained about how much food I ate. He said I was a financial burden. When I turned 16, he told me I needed to start paying rent, $300 a month. I was in high school. I got a job at a fast food place just to pay him. My mom didn't say anything. She never said a word about Roger. She just looked at the floor and told me it would teach me a lesson in responsibility. I worked 20 hours a week during school and 30 during summers. I paid Roger every single month. I never missed once. He never said thank you. He never said he was proud of me. He just took the money and told me I was learning how the real world worked. The day I turned 18, 2 weeks after graduation, Roger told me I had 30 days to move out. He said I was an adult now. He said he and my mom needed their privacy. He said I'd been a guest long enough. My mom cried, but she didn't fight for me. She just helped me pack my things and slipped me $200 when Roger wasn't looking. I moved into a room I rented from an old lady across town. I worked full-time at a warehouse and took night classes at community college. I didn't ask Roger or my mom for anything. Not money, not help, not advice. I figured out everything on my own. How to file taxes, how to fix a car, how to budget so I could eat and pay tuition at the same time. It took me 6 years to get my degree. I became an accountant. Not glamorous, but steady. Good salary, good benefits, room to grow. I moved into my own apartment, then my own condo. I built a life completely separate from Roger and my mom. I saw them maybe twice a year, Thanksgiving and my mom's birthday. Roger always made comments about my job, my car, my clothes. He said accountants were boring. He said I should have gone into business like him. He ran a failing landscaping company that my mom's money kept afloat. But sure, I was the one who made bad choices. I stopped letting his comments bother me. I just smiled, helped my mom with the dishes, and left as soon as I could. 3 months ago, I won the lottery. Not the massive jackpot, but enough. $470,000 after taxes. I didn't tell anyone at first. I paid off my condo. I put a chunk into savings. I bought a new car. Nothing flashy, just reliable. I donated some to a shelter that helped me once when I was 19 and between jobs. I told my mom about a month later. I asked her to keep it between us. I should have known better. She told Roger that same night. He called me the next morning. Not to congratulate me, not to say he was happy for me. He wanted to meet for lunch. He said we needed to discuss the family finances. I should have said no, but part of me was curious. I wanted to see what he would actually say to my face. We met at a diner near his house. He looked the same. Same polo shirt, same smug expression, same way of looking at me like I was still a 16-year-old handing over rent money. He didn't waste time. He said the lottery winnings needed to be distributed fairly. He said he was the head of the family. He said my mom had sacrificed so much to raise me. He said the least I could do was share my good fortune. He had a number in mind. $200,000. He said he'd take it in a lump sum. He said he'd use it to expand his landscaping business. He said it was an investment in the family's future. I asked him what he meant by family. He said him, my mom, and me, we were a unit. We needed to support each other. I reminded him that he kicked me out at 18. He said I needed to grow up. I reminded him that he never once helped me with college, with my first apartment, with anything. He said I was keeping score like a child. Then he got angry. He said I was being selfish. He said my mom was embarrassed by how greedy I was being. He said no one in the family would respect me if I kept the money all to myself. He said he was the man of the house and he had final say on financial matters. He actually thought being married to my mom gave him some kind of authority over my bank account. I let him talk for another 10 minutes. He had plans. A new truck for the business, a vacation for him and my mom, maybe a boat. He talked like the money was already his, like I was just a minor obstacle between him and a spending spree. When he finally stopped, I told him I wasn't giving him anything. His face went from normal to bright red in about 2 seconds. His voice got louder. People at other tables started looking over at us. He told me I was being selfish and ungrateful. He said, family takes care of family. He said I was spitting on everything he and my mom did for me. I kept my voice calm and steady. I reminded him that he kicked me out when I turned 18. I said I've been supporting myself ever since that day. I told him we clearly have very different ideas about what family means. His jaw clenched. His hands gripped the edge of the table, but he didn't have a good answer to that. He switched tactics fast. His voice got softer, almost sad. He said my mom cries every night about how distant I've become. He said money was destroying our relationship. He said she missed having her daughter in her life. I pointed out that he was the one who called this meeting. I said he was the one demanding my money, not me. He slammed his hand down on the table. The silverware jumped. More people looked over. He said I had 1 week to think about what kind of daughter I wanted to be. Then he stood up and walked out. He didn't pay for his coffee. I sat there for another minute, then paid the bill and left. I made it to my car before my hands started shaking. I gripped the steering wheel and just sat there in the parking lot for 20 minutes. Part of me knew this would happen. I knew Roger would try something like this, but hearing him actually say the words, actually demand my money like he had some right to it, made me so angry I could barely think straight. I started the car and drove back to my condo. I went straight to my laptop. I spent the whole evening looking up stuff about family financial pressure and legal protections. I read about other people whose relatives tried to claim they were owed lottery winnings. I learned learned about cease-and-desist letters and harassment laws. I made notes. I saved websites. I felt a little better having information, having a plan. My phone rang around 8 that night. Mom. Her voice sounded small and apologetic when I answered. She said Roger was very upset. She said maybe I could just help them a little bit. Not the full amount, she said, but something to show I care. I asked her why she told Roger about the lottery when I asked her not to. She went quiet for a few seconds. Then she said she tells her husband everything. That's what married people do. I felt something break inside my chest when she said that. I told her I already paid off my condo. I said I put money away for my future. I said I donated to charity. I said I'm not giving Roger anything. She started crying. She said I was tearing the family apart over money. She said I've changed. She said I used to be such a sweet girl. I told her I'm the same person who paid rent at 16. I said I'm the same person who got kicked out at 18. I said, nothing about me has changed except now I have money and Roger wants it. She kept crying. I ended the call. The next morning, I looked up lawyers who handle family law and financial protection. I found Deborah Kensington. Her website said she helps people protect their assets from family pressure. I called her office and got an appointment for that afternoon. I sat in her office and explained everything. Roger demanding $200,000, the diner meeting, my mom's phone call. Deborah took notes the whole time. She wrote down dates and details. She asked questions about Roger's exact words and my mom's involvement. When I finished, she looked up at me and said this happens more than people think. She said we needed to protect my assets right away. Deborah told me to document everything from now on. Every conversation with Roger, every phone call from my mom about money, every text message. She said if Roger tried to make legal threats or harass me, I'd need a clear record of everything. She explained that having documentation makes all the difference if things get worse. I went home that night and started a detailed log. I wrote down everything I could remember from the diner meeting. What Roger said, what I said, the exact amount he demanded, the way he slammed his hand on the table. I wrote it all down with dates and times. I met with Nathaniel Cross, my accountant, 2 days later. I explained the situation with Roger and my mom. Nathaniel helped me restructure my accounts. He added extra security measures. He set up beneficiary designations that completely exclude Roger. Nathaniel said he's seen this before. Family members claiming they're owed lottery winnings. He said legal documentation is the best protection I can get. I felt safer leaving his office. I had lawyers and accountants and documentation. I had protection. 3 days after the diner, Roger called my phone directly. His voice sounded friendly and reasonable, like the diner fight never happened. He said he overreacted. He said he's not asking for the full amount anymore, just $50,000 to help with the business. Just enough to get things stable, he said. I felt safer leaving his office. I had lawyers and accountants and documentation. I had protection. 3 days after the diner, Roger called my phone directly. His voice sounded friendly and reasonable, like the diner fight never happened. He said he overreacted. He said he's not asking for the full amount anymore, just $50,000 to help with the business. Just enough to get things stable, he said. I told him I'm not giving him any amount. I said he needs to stop contacting me about this. I kept my voice firm. His tone changed instantly. The friendly voice disappeared. He said I was going to regret this. He said I was making a huge mistake. He said family doesn't forget betrayal. His voice got louder with each sentence. I told him that threatening me was a bad idea. I said I'm documenting everything he says. Then I hung up. My hands were shaking again, but I felt stronger than I did at the diner. I had lawyers now. I had protection. I had proof of what he was doing. The next morning, my phone lit up with a text from my mom. Then another, then 3 more in a row. I opened the messages and saw paragraphs of text about how hard things were right now. She said the landscaping business was losing money every month. She said Roger was working 14-hour days trying to keep things going. She said he came home exhausted and stressed, and she hated seeing him like that. She said maybe if the business had a little help, just enough to get through this rough patch, everything would be okay again. She never used the word money. She never directly asked me for anything, but every single sentence was designed to make me feel guilty. Every word was crafted to make me picture Roger suffering and my mom suffering, and all of it being my fault because I had money and wouldn't share. I read through all the messages twice. Then I opened my phone's camera and took screenshots of every single one. I saved them to a folder I'd created called documentation. I didn't respond. I put my phone face down on my desk and went back to work. 2 days later, I met Marcus for lunch at a cafe near our office. Marcus and I had worked together for 3 years. He was the person I talked to about everything. The person who knew about my terrible dates and my car troubles and my annoying neighbor who played drums at midnight, but I'd never told him much about my family. I'd mentioned my mom a few times. I'd said my stepdad and I didn't get along, but I'd never explained the whole story. I told him everything that day. About Roger charging me rent at 16, about getting kicked out at 18, about working my way through college alone, about winning the lottery and Roger demanding $200,000 like it was his right, about my mom's guilt trip texts that filled my phone every morning. Marcus put down his sandwich halfway through and just stared at me. He said he had no idea. He said he thought I just had a normal distant relationship with my parents, not this. He said Roger sounded like a piece of work and my mom wasn't much better. He asked what I was going to do. I told him I wasn't giving them anything. I said I had a lawyer now and I was documenting everything. Marcus nodded and said that was smart. Then he said something that made me feel less alone than I had in weeks. He said if Roger ever showed up again, if I ever needed someone there for backup, he would come. He said I shouldn't have to face this alone. I thanked him and meant it. A week after the diner meeting, I was at my desk going through spreadsheets when my desk phone rang. It was the receptionist downstairs. Her voice sounded uncertain. She said my stepfather was in the lobby asking to see me. My heart started pounding immediately. I asked her to repeat what she said. She said a man named Roger was here, and he said he was my stepfather, and he needed to talk to me about something important. I told her I wasn't available. I said to please ask him to leave. She said okay, and the line went quiet. I sat there staring at my computer screen, not seeing anything. My hands were shaking. Roger had come to my workplace. He'd actually driven to my office building and walked into the lobby like he had any right to be there. The audacity of it made me furious and scared at the same time. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother asking if we could talk soon. I didn't respond right away. I needed to figure out what I actually wanted from a relationship with her, if anything was even possible anymore. The next morning, I called her and asked to meet for coffee, just the two of us. She agreed immediately, sounding hopeful in a way that made my chest hurt. We met at a cafe halfway between our homes, neutral territory where Roger wouldn't show up. My mother looked tired when she arrived, dark circles under her eyes and her hands shaking slightly as she stirred sugar into her coffee. I waited for her to speak first, but she just looked at me with sad eyes. I told her I loved her, and I always would, but I couldn't keep having a relationship where she enabled Roger to harass me. She started to protest, and I held up my hand. I explained that I needed one clear boundary. She could contact me directly anytime she wanted to build our relationship, talk about her life, share things that mattered to her. But any mention of money, any pressure to reconcile with Roger, any attempt to guilt me about my choices would result in me ending the conversation immediately. She wiped tears from her face and asked if I really meant that. I told her I'd never been more serious about anything. She nodded slowly and said she would try, though her voice shook when she said it. I wasn't sure she could stick to it. Roger had controlled her for so long that I doubted she knew how to have a conversation without considering what he would think. We finished our coffee in uncomfortable silence and hugged briefly in the parking lot before going our separate ways. That evening, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother's number. The message was clearly from Roger. He wrote that I would regret choosing money over family, that karma would catch up to me, that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I screenshot the message immediately and forwarded it to Deborah with a note about the continued harassment. Then I blocked my mother's number. I felt guilty blocking her, but I needed space from the constant emotional manipulation. The silence that followed was peaceful in a way I hadn't expected. No angry calls, no guilt trips, no messages designed to make me feel like a terrible daughter. But the silence was also sad because it meant accepting that my mother couldn't or wouldn't protect our relationship from Roger's interference. Spent the weekend cleaning my condo and organizing my finances with the new security measures Nathaniel had helped me set up. Over the next month, I focused on building the life I actually wanted with the financial security I now had. I took time off work and booked a trip to Ireland, a place I'd always wanted to visit but never thought I could afford. I walked through ancient castles and sat in tiny pubs, listening to live music. I ate fresh seafood and hiked along dramatic cliffs overlooking the ocean. I didn't worry about costs or budget or whether I could afford the nicer hotel room. The freedom felt strange at first, almost wrong, like I was being too indulgent. But I reminded myself that I'd earned this through years of hard work and pure luck, and I deserved to enjoy it. When I got back, I donated another chunk of money to causes that helped me when I was struggling. The shelter that gave me a place to stay when I was 19 and between jobs, a food bank that kept me fed during my leanest months in college, a scholarship fund for community college students working full-time. Each donation felt meaningful in a way that buying things for myself didn't. I was turning my good fortune into help for people facing the same struggles I'd survived. I scheduled my regular session with Priya, my therapist, after I returned from Ireland. She asked how I was feeling about the situation with my mother and Roger. I told her about blocking my mother's number and the strange mix of peace and sadness that followed. Priya helped me understand that I'd been mourning the loss of a real relationship with my mother since I was 18, maybe even longer. The lottery money didn't create the dysfunction in my family. It just made the dysfunction impossible to ignore anymore. All those years, I'd hoped that somehow things would change, that my mother would stand up to Roger, that we could have a normal mother-daughter relationship. The money forced me to see that those hopes were fantasies. My mother had made her choice over and over again, and that choice was Roger. Priya asked how it felt to finally stop hoping for change. I admitted it was a relief mixed with grief. Relief because I could stop waiting for something that was never going to happen. Grief because accepting the reality meant letting go of the relationship I'd always wanted. The grief was real and heavy, but so was the relief. I felt lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't realize was there until I set it down. A month passed after the family dinner, and things got quiet. Too quiet. I should have known Roger wasn't done, but part of me hoped he'd finally given up. Then my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end said his name was Walter Higgins, and he was Roger's business partner in the landscaping company. He apologized for contacting me out of nowhere, but said he was worried about Roger and my mother. My stomach dropped because business partners don't usually call the family unless something is really wrong. Walter explained that Roger had been taking money from my mother's personal accounts to cover business expenses. He said the landscaping company was losing money every month, and Roger kept promising things would turn around, but they never did. Walter said he'd seen the bank statements because Roger needed him to co-sign something, and the numbers were bad. Really bad. He said my mother's savings were disappearing into a failing business, and she might not even know how much was gone. Walter kept talking, and I could hear the stress in his voice. He said he was trying to exit the partnership because Roger's financial decisions were getting reckless, and he didn't want legal liability when everything collapsed. He said Roger was desperate, and desperate people make dangerous choices. Walter thought I should know that my mother might be in serious financial trouble because of Roger's business failures. He didn't want money from me, and he wasn't asking me to get involved. He just thought someone in the family should know what was really happening. I thanked him for calling and told him I appreciated the warning. As soon as we hung up, I pulled up Deborah's number and called her immediately. She answered on the second ring, and I explained what Walter had just told me. Deborah went quiet for a moment and then asked about my mother's house, the one my father left her. I told her my mother owned it outright with no mortgage because my dad had paid it off before he died. Deborah said that was good because it meant Roger couldn't mortgage the house without my mother's signature, but he could definitely be pressuring her to do exactly that. Deborah told me to check the county property records online to see if any liens had been filed against the house. She walked me through how to access the public records, and I spent the rest of the evening searching through documents I barely understood. Most of it looked normal, just the original deed transfer from my father to my mother and the property tax records. Then I found something dated 2 weeks ago. Roger had tried to take out a home equity line of credit on my mother's house. The application was there in the public records, requesting $75,000 against the property. My hands started shaking as I read through the details. The application listed both Roger and my mother as applicants, but I knew my mother would never risk the house my father left her unless Roger pushed her into it. I screenshot everything and sent it to Deborah with a message asking what this meant. She responded within minutes saying the application existed, but she'd need to check if it was approved. I couldn't sleep that night thinking about Roger trying to take the one thing my father made sure my mother would always have. The next morning, I called my mother directly. She answered on the fourth ring, sounding tired, and I asked her straight out if Roger was trying to mortgage the house. She got quiet, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. I asked again, more gently this time, and she finally admitted that Roger said it was the only way to save the business and their future. Felt sick. I told her that house was her security, the one thing that was completely hers, and she shouldn't risk it for Roger's failing company. She said I didn't understand the pressure she was under, that Roger was her husband, and she had to support him. I reminded her that my father left her that house specifically, so she'd always have a place to live no matter what happened. She started crying and said Roger promised he could turn the business around if he just had one more chance. I asked if she'd signed the application, and she said yes, but the bank hadn't approved it yet. My heart sank because she'd already agreed to risk everything. I took a breath and tried to stay calm. I told my mother I would pay for her to meet with a financial advisor independently, someone who could review her whole situation without Roger being present. I said she needed to see the real numbers, understand how much money was already gone and how much danger she was in. She refused immediately. She said it would be a betrayal of her husband, and she trusted Roger to make financial decisions for their family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I asked her how it was a betrayal to protect herself, and she said I was trying to come between her and Roger. I told her I was trying to help her keep the house my father left her, but she said I just didn't understand marriage and compromise. We went in circles for 20 minutes until I finally gave up. I told her the offer stood if she changed her mind, and then I ended the call before I said something I'd regret. I sat there feeling completely devastated that she was choosing potential financial ruin with Roger over her own security, had a therapy appointment with Priya 2 days later, and I broke down as soon as I sat on her couch. I told her everything about the house and Roger's attempt to mortgage it and my mother refusing help. Priya listened and then said something that hurt, but I needed to hear. She said I cannot save my mother from choices she's actively making. She said my mother is an adult who is choosing to stay with Roger and risk her financial security, and I have to accept that I can't control that. Priya said I could offer help and resources, but I couldn't force my mother to take them, and continuing to push would just hurt me without changing anything. She said the hardest part of loving someone is watching them make bad choices and knowing you can't stop them. I cried through most of the session because accepting that felt impossible. I wanted to protect my mother the way she never protected me, but Priya was right. My mother was making her own choices, and I had to let her face the consequences, even if it destroyed her financially. 2 weeks crawled by, and I heard nothing from my mother or Roger. Then my phone rang early on a Tuesday morning, and it was my mother calling. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She said the bank denied the home equity line of credit because Roger's credit score was too low and the business financials were terrible. She sounded relieved and terrified at the same time. She said she was glad the bank said no because she'd been scared about risking the house, but now she was scared about what Roger would do next. I asked her gently if she'd considered whether staying with someone who would risk her house was safe. She got defensive immediately and said I was twisting everything, that Roger was just trying to save their future, and I was making him sound like a villain. I tried to explain that someone who loves her wouldn't pressure her to risk the house my father left her, but she talked over me, saying I didn't understand their marriage. She hung up before I could say anything else. My phone rang again 10 minutes later from my mother's number. I answered, thinking she was calling back to apologize, but it was Roger's voice that came through the line. line. He was shaking with rage, his words coming out fast and sharp. He said I poisoned the bank against him, that I sabotaged his business on purpose, that I was trying to destroy his marriage to my mother. I told him I had nothing to do with the bank's decision, that his own finances and credit score did that. He called me a liar and said I must have contacted the bank to tell them not to approve the loan. I said that wasn't how banks work, and he needed to stop contacting me. He kept yelling about how I was ruining everything, and I was going to pay for what I'd done to him. Then Roger said something that made my blood run cold. He said he was going to sue me for what he called family contribution. He claimed that because he housed me from 14 to 18, I owed him compensation now that I had money. He said he'd kept receipts and records of everything he spent on me, and I was going to pay it all back, plus interest. It was completely absurd legally, but it scared me emotionally because Roger sounded serious. I told him he was welcome to try, but no lawyer would take that case. He said I'd be hearing from his attorney and hung up. My hands were shaking as I opened the voice recorder app on my phone and realized I'd been recording the whole call. I immediately sent the recording file to Deborah with a message asking if Roger's threat had any legal standing. Deborah called back within 20 minutes of receiving the recording. She told the narrator that Roger had no legal claim whatsoever to the lottery winnings. His threat was baseless intimidation. Since parents can't demand reimbursement years later for fulfilling their basic legal obligation to a minor child, still she warned that desperate people do desperate things, and sent a formal legal letter warning that any frivolous lawsuit would trigger counterclaims for harassment and legal fees. For about a week, everything went quiet, until her mother began texting guilt-laden messages claiming families shouldn't need lawyers and that her late father would be disappointed in her. She didn't respond, instead screenshotting each message and refocusing on work, where she soon earned a promotion to senior accountant. Part 8. Escalation and mediation. Roger later showed up uninvited at her condo building, only to be turned away by the doorman, prompting her to file a police report for documentation. Deborah then arranged a mediation session, where Roger presented handwritten calculations, claiming she owed him $47,000 for raising her, a claim the mediator flatly rejected, stating parents cannot bill children for basic care. At the mediation, she finally said aloud everything she'd held back for years. That fairness would have meant not charging a teenager rent, not kicking her out at 18, and not harassing her as an adult. Roger stormed out, and her mother privately admitted life with him had become unbearable, but still wasn't ready to leave him. Part 9. Boundaries and resolution. How? Met her mother for coffee and set one clear boundary. A relationship was possible, but any mention of money or reconciliation with Roger would end the conversation immediately. When Roger later sent a threatening text from her mother's phone, she blocked the number entirely, choosing peace over constant in the months that followed. She took a healing trip to Ireland, donated to causes that once helped her, and began volunteering with a nonprofit supporting youth aging out of difficult family situations, eventually funding a college scholarship program for kids in situations like her own. 4 months later, Roger's landscaping business filed for bankruptcy, and his last attempt to mortgage the house failed. It remained safely in her mother's name alone. 6 months after winning the lottery, she reflects on a life built entirely on her own terms, financially secure, emotionally boundaried, and purposeful through her volunteer work. Her mother eventually starts seeing a therapist and reaches out again without asking for money, leaving the relationship cautiously open but unresolved. The story closes not with a dramatic family reunion, but with quiet self-acceptance. She can't fix her mother's choices or Roger's greed, only protect herself and help others facing the same struggle she once did. If this story hit home, if you've ever had to choose your own peace over a toxic family member's demands, hit subscribe. Stories like this are exactly what this channel is built on, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.